אבל לקראת חג הפסח, אחת השכנות בבניין עורכת מכירה של בגדי נשים. So, for the Pesach holiday, one of the neighbors in our building is setting up a sale for women's clothing. The goremet shaharbe ovrim v'shavim nichnasim lebinyan. And this is creating a bit of a disturbance because there's a lot more foot traffic coming in and out of the building. Ha'im ani chola limchot ba. So there's a woman asking the shaila, and she says, I'm not really happy about this. I think it's wonderful to buy clothes for Pesach, but I don't need the extra added foot traffic in my apartment. Kevin shalita'anata ein lahem parnasa v'zeh dvar mitzvah. So the argument that the seller makes is that my husband and I don't have a parnasa, and it's clothing for the yantif, which is a mitzvah. So you can't stop a neighbor from doing a mitzvah. Okay? So, yeah, it may be temporary, but, things like this that are temporary eventually become permanent, She sees she'll be successful, so she'll set up a whole boutique in her apartment. Now, there may be issues of Dina de Malchusa here. I don't know whether Rav Sharaga is going to be discussing the issues of Dina de Malchusa. Maybe he has a conflicted view of Dina de Malchusa in Eretz Yisrael. But certainly, from a Dina de Malchusa standpoint, if a person is not allowed to set up a retail business in a residential area, it's not zoned for it, so then that's in itself a reason why I could insist that the person cease and desist. But let's take a look at the tshuva. He says, right, well, as we'll see, the classic example of opening up a business that is a mitzvah business is education. Like if I want to open up a cheder in my apartment and have little kids come in and out. So that is the classic example. So Kosav Moran b'Shulchan Aruch, Echad min b'nei hamavoy shebikesh la'asot rovei o mirpa'a b'mavoy, yicholim hashchenim la'akev alav. So the first thing we need to realize is that the Shulchan Aruch paskins that if one of the members of the mavoy, now remember the mavoy system is an ancient world neighborhood. Right? There was a small alleyway, and there would be courtyards off of the alleyway, and typically there's 2 houses per courtyard, but not always. Sometimes there could be 4 houses per courtyard. And so one of the members of our mavoy wants to open up either a clinic or a doctor's office. So the shchenim, the neighbors, can put a stop to it. And this is true even if he gets the consent of every single neighbor except for one. That one person can say, no, I don't want it. I don't want the extra foot traffic. But he does add there, but if this neighbor, instead of opening up a clinic, wants to open up a place to teach Torah in his house, ein hashchenim yecholim limchot bo. Then the neighbors cannot prevent such an establishment from opening up. V'chein l'chol dvar mitzvah, einam yecholim limchot bo. And the same thing would be true for any mitzvah enterprise. The neighbors cannot prevent him from opening up. V'lochein b'mikreh, שעושים מכירה בתוך בניין מגורים וזה מפריע לשכנים, יכולים למחות בו. And therefore, if a person is setting up a retail establishment in his house, which is an apartment building, and it creates a disturbance for the neighbors have a right to protest. ואפילו שכן יחידי יכול למחות, אפילו ששאר השכנים מסכימים. And even one neighbor has a right to put up a fuss, and the halacha would be on his or her side, even if all of the other neighbors agree. Now, va'afilu she'ha'isha osa zot letzarach parnasata. Now, what about the argument that she's doing this for her parnasa? The Harama Kotav Shabizman Hazeh Parnasa Udvar Mitzvah. The Rama does write that nowadays making a parnasa is doing a mitzvah. You're going to do a mitzvah by going out to work. Ubidvar mitzvah ein orashayla akev. And when a neighbor says I'm doing a mitzvah, the other neighbors cannot stop them from operating that mitzvah enterprise. So on that, Kosav Hachsam Sofer, the Masha HaGemara Amra Shebetalmud Torah Lo Yochol Limchot. So the Chassam Sofer says not so fast. He says the fact that the Gemara says that for Torah study, if I'm teaching Torah in my house, the neighbors cannot protest. Hainu mishum she'im yitbatlu hatalmidim nimtza shehamochem mevatel mitzvah shemutelet gam alav. He says, since making sure that kids are learning Torah is a communal responsibility, it's not just that one guy's responsibility to make sure that the kids in the neighborhood have Torah study. It's all of our responsibility. And therefore, because it's a mitzvah that's incumbent upon all of the neighbors, that's the reason why the neighbors, because they are sharing that mitzvah, they can't protest. Because you can't stop a guy from doing a mitzvah that he's doing both for himself and for you. But masha'en came parnasa, lamrot shehi mitzvah, lefarneset banavu v'nei veto. But when it comes to parnasa, that's a totally different situation. He says, upon whom is placed the mitzvah to make sure that you have a parnasa? That's your mitzvah. It's not my mitzvah to make sure that you have a parnasa. I guess in a sense, indirectly it is, because I'm not allowed to see anyone starve in my community. But it's not a direct mitzvah, right? Zu mitzvah shemutelet rak alav, avolo ala shchenim. That's a mitzvah that's only upon the individual. It's not a mitzvah that's upon the neighbors. V'lachein zchuto shel kol shachen imchot. And therefore, the right is for every neighbor to lodge a protest. Every neighbor has the right to protest. And the Chassam Sofer therefore writes, and he says, I refer you further to what the Chassam Sofer there writes in Bava Basra, which is interesting. I guess there's two places where the Chassam Sofer makes this argument. One is in his Shilas and Shuvas, and the other one is in his Gemara commentary. Okay.
We all have a mitzvah not to stand idly by and someone is really in front of the neighbor on Shabbos to help them. So why is that?
Again, right. So I suppose the argument is that yes, it's a mitzvah to heal the sick, but it's not a direct mitzvah. In other words, we had mentioned this the last time that we had looked through this, is that it also seems you can make the argument healing the sick is a mitzvah. So I'm just opening up a clinic to help people.
More than helping people.
Yeah. I suppose I guess maybe you might be able to make an argument where if my clinic is only for people who have life-threatening illnesses, well, what about a person who needs, let's say, is suffering from post-nasal drip, and or something like that? I guess maybe.
Because I'm thinking about like when a doctor's on call, they don't know what's going to come.
Right, which is the rationale that you can pick up your phone on Shabbos, even if you don't know who it is, right? Because it's safek pikuach nefesh, right? But I guess the argument would be that there's no mitzvah upon the entire community to set up a doctor in the community, which is an interesting statement, there is no obligation upon the community. In other words, I think when we look at the infrastructure of what a Jewish community is, there are a number of things that are halachically incumbent upon the community to establish. One is a mikveh, another is a school for Talmud Torah for the kids, another is a shul, but there's no halachic requirement upon the entire community to set up a hospital or to set up a doctor's clinic, which is quite interesting. You could ask yourself the question, well, why not? Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to make that analogy because, in the ancient world, medicine was not what it was in the Middle Ages, and it's not what it was in the Middle Ages compared to today. So I think that might need to be reassessed. But at least from his perspective, it's not a communal responsibility to heal the sick. It's something that you can go from Minsk to Pinsk if you need to in order to seek out a doctor. It's not one of those things that a community has a responsibility to set up. Question is why not? And it's a valid question, but that maybe requires a little bit more research. Yeah. Now, what about Paul's question? The fact that they're only setting up the sale, this woman is only setting up the sale before Pesach. So you could say, well, it's not for very long that I'm creating this nuisance. It's only for a little while. Yachol kol Choshen la'akev. That doesn't mitigate the fact that each neighbor still has a right to protest. He says, because since, after all, the foot traffic for this boutique business are coming in through the same stairwell and common area that is reserved for the tenants of the building or the area, לכן זכותו של כל שכן שמרגיש שמפריע לו למנוע מאחרים שלא ישתמשו ברכוש שלו. It is therefore the right of every single neighbor to prevent people from using that which he has rights of access to. If he finds it to be inconvenient or it makes him uncomfortable, so he has a right to protest. And furthermore, and here's an even bigger chiddush, let's say this woman was set up in her boutique now for several weeks, and she says, well, I've established already a chazaka. I've established a pattern, right? Any neighbor at any time can protest, and no one can say that I've established a chazaka. Okay.
Common scenarios here.
That's right. That's right. Are you aware of any? What is the law in Ontario as far as Airbnb in an apartment building, or where there's common space?
New York, they mandated that 30 days has to be no more short-term rental in there.
Really?
Leasing it.
Some you want to kind of vehicle corporation. They don't make their own condo bylaws.
Wow.
Yeah.
What would you say? Which corporation? Yeah, they can set up their own rules. Yeah. Okay. Now, in the footnote, he writes as follows. He says, he said, it would seem to me that this issue of preventing a neighbor from using a common area really is a machlokas between the Mechaber and the Rama. B'din shachein sherotza lasim tanur beveito, v'ha'ashan yazik l'shchenim ba'ofen sheha'ashan eino tadir. He says, because they undertake the following halachic issue. A neighbor wants to set up an oven, a certain kind of oven. Okay, I better plug in my PC. A certain kind of oven he wants to set up. And this oven emits smoke that creates a nuisance for the neighbors, but the neighbor argues that it's only temporary, or that it's something that's very, very uncommon. In other words, he only uses it with great irregularity. Okay. Demaran katav de lechatchila matzi hashachen la'akev alav. That the Mechaber is of the opinion that any neighbor can say, still, I don't want it. Amnam harama sham kasav diyesh omrim dafilu lechatchila ef shela'akev alav v'shachein nira lo laharas ayin sham. That the Rama writes that if it's something that's infrequent, then there are those who maintain that a neighbor cannot prevent it from taking place, and that is how he paskins. Ayin od b'shach sham u'v'nesivis shehiskimu l'dat maran. He says, and when we look at the Shach and the Nesivos, two commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, they side with the Mechaber that even infrequent nuisances can be prevented. Omnam hapischei tshuva sham hevi shagon Rabbi Akiva Eger hiskim l'divrei harama ayin sham. But the pischei tshuva cites Rabbi Akiva Eger, who sides with the Rama, that if it's an infrequent nuisance, then the neighbors cannot stop it. Ve'imkein hachinami shazu mechira chad pe'amit ve'ena tedira l'chora yiyeh taloi b'machloket hanal. And therefore, maybe perhaps we could argue that this is a machlokes. When a woman has an infrequent boutique sale in her home, maybe the lefi maran hashachen yuchal la'akev alav l'dat harama lo yuchal. That this would be the machlokes according to the Mechaber. You would, which is the house of most Sephardim paskin, you would be allowed to raise a larger protest and prevent the neighbor. And according to the Rama, you would not be allowed to. Omnam, however, yesh lechalek da'hama'ayin b'shulchan aruch sham yireh denechleku maran v'rama ba'ashan she'eno tadir. He says, however, if you look more carefully at that case in the Shulchan Aruch, you'll discover that the machlokus is with an oven that very infrequently emits smoke. Which means that the oven may be operating on a daily basis, but there's only for a short amount of time over the course of the day that the oven is emitting smoke. Yet the oven is operating on a daily basis. And the argument that the Rama wants to make is that since it's such a short interval during the day, it's only creating a very short-term nuisance, even though it's happening every single day. Masha'en kein benidon didan shegam imnema sheyesh ktsat hezek beriboy hanichnasim. He says, but in our situation, you may want to argue that it's creating even less of a nuisance, just to have added foot traffic. Mikol makom zerak pam b'shana, but it's only once a year, and it's not happening on a daily basis. V'yesh lomar da'afilu maran hashulchan aruch yoda b'chiyai gavna shashchenim lo yicholim la'akev alav. And maybe we could make the argument that even the Mechaber would hold that this is not such a long-term nuisance as the oven, which has a daily emission of smoke. But she's only doing it. She says, I'm only doing it it's only a 1 week sale. And so, or 3-day sale, like whatever it is. What are you hacking me for? Maybe even the Mechaber would agree that you can't stop them. However, Amnam lefi divrei Rabbeinu Hagon Shlita, yesh lechalek leidach gisa. But we could argue to the other side also, according to what Rav Sharaga is saying. Da'adkan lo heter harama eladavka betanur, shehu osa betok shalo, umemela ha'ashan holech ledirat chavero. Because in the case of the smoke, the neighbor is operating an oven on his property, and the smoke emits out of his property into his neighbor's space. But in this case, it's not that there is an emission of something from one person's property to the others, but rather the neighbor is responsible for creating a nuisance in a shared space that all the neighbors have the same rights to. יש לומר דגם הרמה יודע שיכולים לעכב אפילו לכתחילה, כיוון דלכל אדם יש זכות לעכב שלא יכנסו אנשים לרשותו. He says, in that situation, there's a shared property. I have a portion in that shared property. I have rights in that shared space, and therefore I have an even greater right to stop the operation of added foot traffic on that shared space. It's not like it's even worse than the case of the smoke, where the smoke is coming from your property and just wafting over to my area. So that you might want to make a distinction that there's a difference between long-term and short-term. But in this situation, maybe even short-term, I can stop you because it's directly an intrusion on something that I have direct rights to. So there's a lot to discuss here because there's a lack of clarity about whether or not this is worse or better than the case of the smoke coming out of the neighbor's oven.
Well, the situation as Rabbi said earlier, it starts as a 3-day event with the justice and prolong if she's successful. The smoke thing is not going to increase. That's as much as I'm going to admit. It's going to be every day forever, and it's only like that 5 minutes a day. So that's as far as it can go.
Or I mean, we don't know. Who knows?
We're saying it's operating at full tilt, and that's how much it emits, as opposed to the dressing, which could extend.
Well, maybe the neighbor's oven business, his bakery business, or whatever he's making, could become so successful that it goes beyond 5 minutes eventually.
I thought it's just when it operates at full strength, only 5 minutes a day is where the smoke. That's how I know the case. It depends how you do.
And then the next footnote, he writes, L'chora haya nir'eh. He says, as far as making that Rav Shraga also said that no matter how long the neighbor has been operating the business without protest, any neighbor has a right to protest. I recently was presented with the following shaila. 2 business owners are working near each other, and they share a parking space area, which is reserved for customers only. For years, one of the business operators has been allowing his employees to park there, and the other business owners have looked the other way. This guy, who only recently moved into this business space, says, what are you doing letting your employees park in that area that's for customers only? My customers are presented with this nuisance that they have to find street parking because you've prevented them from parking in the lot. And it would seem that regardless of how long the other businessman has been allowing his employees to park in those parking spaces, the new business owner has every right to say no. I leased this space specifically because one of the benefits is that there was customer parking for my customers. You have no right to so the guy can't say, well, I've established a chazaka. You haven't established a chazaka. The landlord acknowledges that you're in the wrong by letting your employees park there. So it escalated into a serious conflict. The guy, the long-term business owner who was letting his employees park there, accused the new business owner of being a maser because he called the parking authority, telling him to ticket the cars. And they got into a big fight, right? I don't know how it's resolved because I offered to help resolve it, but they never took me up on it. They called, but I spoke to both sides, you know. But it's one of those situations where a chazaka doesn't help when you're clearly in the wrong. Okay? But let's see what the footnote says about that. It says, L'chora hayanira deharei gam moran hashulchan aruch shekasav gabi ashan sheino toder sheyachol la'akev alav lechatchila. He says, now, according to the Rama, who says that even infrequent smoke, right, it's only a few minutes every day, every neighbor has a right to protest. However, the Machaber also writes that if the neighbor sees the smoke operating and doesn't say anything, then he doesn't have a right to later protest. It would therefore seem that in this situation, if someone opens up a boutique in the apartment building and the neighbors didn't protest, they shouldn't have the right to protest if they were quiet for a certain amount of time. Omnam, however, however, we can explain it further with another statement from the Machaber, Zelashono. If you have a store that's in a courtyard, you know what, I want to give this proper time. So we'll finish this piece, Mirz Hashem, tomorrow. Okay? Have a great day, everybody.